silent pavilion, so you will need to put your headphones on so that you can hear not just me, but everybody who's going to present this afternoon. So good afternoon and welcome to the Buildings and Cooling Pavilion. I'm Andy Deacon, Co-Managing Director of the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy. And we've been leading some work with cities across the world that includes work on nature-positive solutions and infrastructure, and delighted to be moderating and emceeing this session on pathways to nature-positive solutions, integrating nature-based solutions into urban infrastructure design. Later on, we're going to hear from a panel of speakers on how integrated urban nature-positive solutions can be scaled and financed over the longer term. And we'll also hear more about tangible examples of tools in this space from AECOM, USAID WWF, and UN Habitat. But first, I'm delighted to introduce not one, but two keynote speakers. So first up, I'll hand the floor in just a moment to good friend and colleague Gulnara Roll, head of the Cities Unit at UNEP. And then we'll also hear from Henrik Neufeld from the UNEP Copenhagen Climate Collaborating Center. So Gulnara, over to you.
Thank you so much, Andy, and we're so delighted that actually you're moderating and we again with GCOM together, because I think this group is bringing together several communities, because I think on everything on cities, also nature-based cities, we speak like about different dimensions of cities, right? We speak about kind of here we speak about more nature-based solutions, like the urban planning, but also there is a kind of more urban and nature dimension, but also about governance dimension, right? So, and I don't know, Andy, in this meeting, where you would like to put more focus. It's probably, of course, it depends also on speakers, but I think it's really meeting gives opportunity to have this balance, looking more into the kind of urban fabrics and also into the technical solutions, while at the same time also speaking, how on the political level and the governance level we can actually implement those, implement those. I think both aspects are very important, but sometimes we are not really making a big, distinction of this, and this is what we should, I think, what we should do. So yes, it's also my pleasure to welcome those whom I did not meet before. So my name is Gulnara Rolle. I'm head of the Cities Unit at United Nations Environment Program, but I also in a way, one of the kind of hostess of this pavilion, because I'm also head of the Secretariat of the Global Alliance Building and Construction. So actually for 2 weeks we had very exciting program here, and we went to very kind of technical topics into the questions of also cities cooling, cities buildings, building standards, building materials, passive design. So all these topics actually are very important, and I think what we are promoting in this pavilion as well, but also in our everyday work, is an integrated approach, kind of looking into kind of urban planning, design, ecosystem restoration in a very integrated way. And why we are here today and why we are all kind of working together. And from what I see here, there are very many people with whom we work together actually on kind of everyday basis. This is because, under the global ABC, we realize that emissions from cities are improving, increasing. Our global ABC status report shows that there is actually no trend. There is no really trend of decreasing of the emissions from cities and infrastructure. And still, practically every day, we are building a new big city. And this is definitely, this is especially regionally, especially in Africa, in Asia, that's the case. Where each of us in our organization, we are trying to do something about this. Also at UNEP, we have quite a number of the technical cooperation projects. We're working on the, national social housing programs, on national buildings or subnational buildings or cooling action plans. We have a generation restoration project. We're working with 23 cities to promote ecosystem approach. But of course, mitigation measures are very limited, and where we are not able to mitigate, and in many ways we are not able to mitigate, because also there is not enough funding. I mean, technical solution exists. What we are doing here also, I mean, in organization and Pavilion as well, we're trying to strengthen our partnership between different organizations, because each of us individually cannot resolve it. So we need to work together, and also through the discussions we're able to do so. If we are not able to mitigate, then we have to adapt. And this is where I would like to give floor to Henry, who is the Chief Scientific Editor of the UNEP Global Adaptation Report. Please, Henry.
Thank you so much, Gulnara. Let me take this thing off. I hear myself better. Yes, so thanks for this short-term invitation. It's a real honor to be here and talk a little bit about the work that we've done just recently in the Adaptation Gap Report, which we launched a week ago, roughly, 2 weeks ago, sorry, just before COP. And we had a high-level event on the 18th, at the beginning of this week, to discuss the Adaptation Gap Report key findings. And what I'll say here in this context is something that we didn't talk about during this high-level event, but something we did for the very first time in this year's Adaptation Gap Report. Normally I'd pull out an example in the report. I've given away my last copy of this report, but you're all invited to download it from the UNEP website. So this year, for the first time, we also look at urban adaptation actions. Normally, our focus is on national level adaptation, planning, implementation, finance, and this year's report also looks at capacity building and technology transfer in detail. But from the implementation side, for the first time, we're looking at local action, adaptation action at the city level, and for that we used the Carbon Disclosure Project's database. This is a database that focuses primarily on mitigation, but they've been doing quite a good work on adaptation as well for some years. It's self-reported, and because it's self-reported, there is a bias in the Americas and in Europe in terms of what is being reported as adaptation actions in urban contexts. However, we are able to say things for all global regions. And first I'll start with the hazards. So there's, of course, cities report all sorts of hazards, but there's a clear message that flooding and heat are the two key hazards that all cities worldwide deal with most. 50%, more than 50% of the actions relate to flooding and heat. And of course, coastal zone management, etc. These are things that are relevant to specific contexts, fire, etc., etc. The second thing I'll say is the responses that cities implement to address these hazards primarily focus on infrastructure, gray solutions, but in second place, we find nature-based solutions as the ways that cities implement adaptation actions, and there's a lot of behavioral stuff going on as well that's important. But we see that there is an increasing focus on nature-based solutions in urban actions, and I should add that we analyzed over 3,500 adaptation actions in this database, and that the cities that we look at capture 25% of all cities over 1 million inhabitants. So it's a really broad sample of information that we're looking at here. So the responses are infrastructure, gray solutions, engineering solutions, but also strongly nature-based solutions, and we should look at that more closely. Third point is that there are huge co-benefits to the investment in adaptation. Adaptation pays off. It's really much better to prepare than to deal with the damages and the losses once they occur. So there's co-benefits in the terms primarily of health, There's co-benefits with regard to economic benefits, jobs creation, social benefits, inclusion, and there's co-benefits connected to greenhouse gas emission reductions. So these are all things that cities report on in their actions. So huge co-benefits to be had when adapting to climate impacts. So the question of this panel here today is, how do we get there? And I'm just going to sort of walk you across one slide I've got here in front of me, which is to overcome the structural barriers to nature-based solutions, focusing on an integrated set of policy levers. So, our vision is to implement effective and scalable nature-based solutions at all scales, local to national, maybe even regional and global. And in order to do that, in producing resilient and connected ecosystems. But there are systemic enablers that need to be in place for this to happen. We need inclusive governance, we need smart spatial planning, and we need progressive economic and financial regulation. These three systemic enablers are necessary for the investment in nature-based solutions. But there are also barriers that stop that from happening. And there are social cultural barriers, institutional barriers, and economic barriers that I'll talk about very briefly. When it comes to social cultural barriers, we talk about insufficient recognition of rights to indigenous people and local communities. That's something that needs to be addressed. And then there are a lot of missing social incentives that we require for social cultural barriers to be overcome. The institutional barriers consist of conflicting policy frameworks, because in the past we used to focus on infrastructure and gray engineering solutions. They are not necessarily, and very often not, compatible with nature-based solutions, which we need going forward. There is also limited government capacity and a lot of corruption in many places going on that inhibit this kind of investment in longer-term benefits. Gray solutions sell better. That's just the case. So we need to overcome these institutional barriers. And thirdly, economic challenges is undervaluing natural capital. We need to be able to assess the benefits that ecosystem services and biodiversity provide us with. I already talked about adaptation benefits and co-benefits. This is what I'm talking about here. Nature has a much higher value than it is given credit for. We need to find better solutions, better ways of assessing that and providing that information. There's also insufficient and poorly directed finance. We need to increase the volume of finance. We've shown that in the adaptation gap report. There's a huge gap between what is coming to countries and what their needs are. This is a huge gap, and there is a great opportunity both for the public sector and the private sector to engage with this. And we need to create the enabling conditions that direct private sector investment in areas, particularly in for nature-based solutions. And one of the reasons I'd say that private sector is not so much engaged in nature-based solutions is because it has a different return on investment flow. Cash flows are different between gray infrastructure and nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions take time to provide their benefits, whereas gray infrastructure provides the benefits instantaneously from the moment they're produced. But after that, there is a degradation. So sometimes it's useful to have hybrid solutions, but we need to create incentives for private sector to be able to engage in nature-based solutions because we know that they have long-term benefits. For that to happen, we need public-private partnerships, blended finance, solutions that de-risk investments for the private sector. Because in the long term, there will be benefits, but in the short term, there are costs. And the private sector often does not have the ability to deal with these kind of costs. And that's what we need the public sector to deal with for. Thanks all.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And just to echo very quickly some of what you said, in the wake of the IPCC's sixth assessment report, then we worked with a group of authors to produce a summary for urban policymakers and conducted a series of workshops in different parts of the world. And one of the messages that came through very strongly was around the focus on blue-green solutions and not just grey, but a recognition that some of the kind of local government financial economic barriers, even from a procurement perspective also, made some of that very difficult. So then we said we wanted to keep this practical, and I know Gulnara is a woman who likes to keep things very practical. So we're going to give some examples of how we can start to deliver this. So we've got presentations of a couple of tools that are helping with the integration of nature-based solutions. So first up, I'd like to welcome to the stage Virawit Tianchainen, Chief of Party of USAID, WWF Mekong for the Future, and online, Robert Spencer, Global Head of ESG Advisory for AECOM. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, the organizer, on behalf of the USAID WWF. We are very pleased to be invited to join these sessions. And, okay. Okay, sure. Thank you. Yeah. So, it's my pleasure to be talking to everyone here. I think that I believe that people here are the coolest people in the COP29 because we are in the cooling pavilion. So, and I think that as we are here today, we are talking about the nature positive and climate resilient infrastructure. And this is actually an opportunity for transition that we have been hearing from the opening remarks just now. And as we can be more practical to talk about this, so we could look at the current state of infrastructure development. And as you can see that, I mean, we have done our research globally, and we come to the number that there's about $4 trillion of core infrastructure that will be built every year until the years in the next 20 years until 2050. And if we're looking at all of those planning for the constructions, we could see that about 75% of infrastructure expected in 2050 does not yet exist. And this is actually a large-scale development that we are reshaping countries in Asia and also globally. And this actually presents a growth which creates opportunity for development, but also significant challenges, including degradation of the national capitals, threat to ecosystem services, deforestation, soil and vegetarian changes, habitat loss, disruption of local life, and also biodiversity and increase in emissions. So we have to ask ourselves a question: why can infrastructure enhance climate resilience and adaptability while supporting local communities? At USAID and WWF, we have done this kind of like groundbreaking research which we launched mid of this year. This is kind of like interesting research because normally research has been done by the governments or the private sector. But this research was done together with civil society and communities in the greater Mekong and Southeast Asia. And what we found from this that I would like to maybe share a couple of key points, that there's an opportunity for us to integrate global agreements and commitments so that we will be able to maintain biodiversity, reduce emissions, and improve resilience. And that would help us to lift millions out of poverty because of all of these projects that we would be able to implement. There's a potential that if it's done inclusively and resiliently, infrastructure can meet 60% of sustainable development goals. Placing natural asset and ecosystem at the core can benefit both community and the environment. And as such, we are proposing a holistic model for resilience and inclusive linear infrastructure in ASEAN in collaboration with civil society organizations. And by working together, we hope that we would be able to advocate for domestic regulation to ensure coordination throughout infrastructure life cycles. We will be able to also emphasize early assessment and management of risks before major investments are made. And there's a call for institutionalized planning that could integrate national capital and ecosystem services and climate change impact and infrastructure needs. So if we look at the visions that we have, we could look at the resilience that we would be able to have in the Southeast Asia and also globally. That's we would be able to tackle the critical challenge in which we would be able to manage conflicting goals of global agreements on climate, biodiversity, food security, and sustainable development at the regional, national, and subnational levels. But this would require that we are moving away from short-term, cost-driven plannings, and we emphasize on nature-based solutions that convey resilience to community and economies. By filling in critical planning gaps to better harness nature benefits for people, infrastructure, and economy. So the key message here is that there's a transforming infrastructure planning that can create resilient system, but we must decide to envision and act on this transformation now. And that concludes my presentation. That my colleagues, Robert, will continue with the presentation of the tools. But I'd like to leave the key message, the key takeaway that the future holds immense potential for sustainable and inclusive development of all stakeholders through innovative infrastructure planning. And you can access the full report with the QR code here. Thank you.
So I'm hoping that Robert's online and is going to continue with the presentation.
Hi, Andy. I hope you can hear me okay.
Yeah, very well. Great.
That's good. That's good. Well, nice to be with you. I'm really sorry I couldn't be there in person this time. I'm certainly missing the excitement of being at a COP, but hope to see many of you again next time at Belém in Brazil. But yes, thank you very much for inviting me to come on and talk about the WWF FIDIC Nature Positive Infrastructure Playbook. So you said you wanted to get really practical, Andy. I think this is a really practical piece of guidance here. I don't know if we can get my slides up. There we are. Perfect. Thank you so much. So you may remember last year when we were in Dubai, we'd actually just published the first version of this playbook. And if you can cast your minds back, you'll remember that we had organized ourselves around 200 different case studies of nature positive infrastructure. And from that, we'd synthesized this playbook, which covers different sectors in the infrastructure world, and then looks at the different benefits of nature positive approaches or nature-based solutions within those infrastructure development types, and then looks at the solutions themselves. How do you actually build those out? Now, according to the popular response to that playbook, there was a real need to have an additional area of work covered, which is what we've done here. And we released this actually at the FIDIC Global Infrastructure Conference back in September, so it's still pretty fresh off the press. And it really talks to some of the things that the previous couple of speakers have talked about, which is procurement of infrastructure is one of the ways in which you're going to be able to have the maximum impact if you want to introduce more nature positive approaches. And I think it's been said very expertly already that there are significant, I wouldn't say blockers, but sort of traditional ways of doing things with respect to grey infrastructure and traditional infrastructure designs in terms of how they get paid for, what the returns on investment are, and so on, which mean that habitually client-side actors who are developing a brief for organizations like I work for AECOM, a multidisciplinary engineering and environmental consultancy, and there's many others in the room in that COP who come from our background. We're effectively the infrastructure enablers But we very much go off the client's brief. Now, the client might be a contractor developer, it might be a multilateral development bank, it might be a government agency like a transport agency or a highways agency or a rail agency. These organizations set the brief, they set the scope of work. And if they haven't included nature positive approaches in their brief, then when organizations like ours respond, we won't cost those kinds of interventions because that would be extra work, so-called scope creep. So what we need is the client side actors, the government agencies, the contractors and developers to actually be intelligent clients, integrate into their traditional scopes and briefs for organizations like us, nature positive infrastructure opportunities. And that takes work because this is a new area, right? I think the last but one speaker talked about the fact that the valuation of both the natural capital assets that ecosystem functions flow from that allow us to get benefits like climate mitigation, carbon sequestration, resilience to climate impacts. The data and the financial information around those natural assets isn't as mature as it is for our traditional steel, concrete, cement, tarmac, the traditional things that we build infrastructure with. And so there's more work to do to, if you like, monetize and put an asset price on the nature positive infrastructure and sometimes the hybrid infrastructure that you can get, particularly around coastal defenses, where you might have some nature-based approaches, perhaps enhanced or restored oyster beds or coral reefs, which actually act as a drag on the storm surges, and then you come to your mangroves, and then you actually come to perhaps some hard infrastructure as well. So those hybrid approaches are really important. So the point being, you need more financial information around the valuation and the pricing of the impacts that those the positive impacts those infrastructure assets, those natural infrastructure assets can provide, and then you need people to procure them. So if we can move to the next slide, I think that just gives us a bit more insight onto what the new chapter or the new content in the playbook actually does. So it's really providing an overview of those standards, legislation, policy that is likely to be a good platform from which you can implement nature positive solutions into developments, get those tips and hints for how to integrate that into the brief. So what we've done in the main part of this new content is we've set out how procurement processes can look at existing principles, tools, and approaches to embed nature positive approaches into the procurement process. And as I've already said, and it's reiterated here, this new content is really aimed at the client side actors, funders, the developers, the government departments, and the contractors. And I've just got one more slide because I don't want to take too much time on this. I know we've got a lot of interesting panel discussions to go through too. But if there's one more slide, I think I do set out sort of 4 key messages, yes, that I want people to take away from this. And that is that certainly in some jurisdictions, we're starting to see nature positive approaches and indeed biodiversity net gain become mandatory for development. So in the UK, for example, you may know it's mandatory for any significant development to achieve a 10% net gain in biodiversity as a result of the development taking place off the existing baseline where the development's occurring. So that's really good because that actually drives the developers and the clients who want to have the infrastructure developed. Think about that because it means that you might actually have some nature-based solutions on site and you might have some nature-based solutions down the road perhaps in terms of biodiversity offsets or carbon sequestration. So the second takeaway is that there is good guidance already there in the realm. And this new guidance that we've developed with this additional chapter of the playbook brings some of that together and gives you some really good pointers on positive solutions. The other key thing is that stakeholder engagement is really important for this. As I've said, awareness still needs to be raised about the asset pricing of different types of nature positive infrastructure intervention and the valuation of those methods and the return on investment, and most importantly, the procurement process. So folks on the client side need to get together with folks on our side, the implementers and the enablers of the infrastructure, to actually workshop out, okay, how do we work together on developing a scope or a brief of work that's going to leave us with a really much more enhanced asset for community and society at large, because it integrates nature and physical infrastructure together. And so those are the strategies and project approaches that I leave you with. And I hope that those folks that managed to have a look at the playbook and read about it will then be much more confident in setting out their briefs and their scopes of work for infrastructure and including nature right at the center of it. Back to you, Andy.
Thank you so much, and a round of applause, please. Thank you, Robert. Nice to see you, even if virtually rather than here in person. And thank you for those takeaway messages, which set things out very clearly and very practically as well. So thank you for those.
Thank you, Andy.
On to a second tool presentation. So we're coming over to UN Habitat. Delighted to welcome to tell us more about some of her work, Alina Koshmina from UN Habitat. Over to you.
Thank you. Hope you can hear me well. Great. Thank you for the introduction, and great to be here with you today. My name is Alina. I work at UN Habitat Planning, Finance and Economy section. So we look at nature-based solutions from a planning perspective on how we can integrate nature into urban planning processes. And the importance of spatial planning was already highlighted also by our keynote speakers. And I'm going to focus a bit on that during my presentation. I have this. Perfect. Okay. So I wanted to start with one number that comes from the 2024 World Cities Report that was actually launched at the World Urban Forum in Cairo 2 weeks ago. And that looks at urban green spaces. And as you can see from this number, we can see that the percentage of urban green spaces has actually declined from around 20% in 1990 to around 14% in 2020. So we're actually seeing a decrease in urban green spaces around the world. And so the main question that we want to ask is how we can reverse this trend, how we can actually promote more green spaces in our urban areas. And at UN Habitat, we work on nature-based solutions. We try to encourage and to support cities in incorporating nature-based solutions into urban planning processes and climate action strategies. We also advocate together with partners on preserving and enhancing biodiversity in urban areas through adequate guidance also on spatial planning. We also support policies, regulatory tools that incorporate nature-based solutions together with other global goals and climate goals. And we also provide tools and knowledge sharing and training to cities to implement and plan their nature-based solutions. So because we want to talk about something practical, I also brought some tools, and there are many great tools that have been developed for nature-based solutions specifically. But what we also want to understand at UN Habitat is how we can actually mainstream and integrate nature-based solutions into our existing tools, and how existing tools that we have can be used also for nature-based solutions. So one of the tools I'm presenting to you is the Citywide Public Assessment tool, which actually helps local governments to gather data on their public spaces in their cities. And the nice thing about this tool is that it encourages the integration and the data collection through also the citizens and residents in the city. And so there is a paper format of this toolkit, but there's also now a digital toolkit that allows the data collection through, for example, smartphones. And this toolkit looks at 5 the dimensions of public space, which are accessibility, distribution, quality, quantity, and the network also of public spaces across the city. Should I go back? See some people taking pictures. I can also provide the slides later if you want, yes. And this toolkit for now, this public space toolkit has been used since 2050 in more than 30, but even I think now 40 cities around the world. And it has engaged many data collectors from the cities. So almost 2,000 data collectors have actually participated in using this assessment tool. And how does it link to nature-based solutions is actually that this data that is collected through the tool can be used to generate maps and evidence for spatial planning. And so one example is from a project that was done in the United Arab Emirates, where the cities face many challenges linked to, for example, urban heat, which also links to urban health challenges, especially for vulnerable communities and children. And so UN Habitat was working with UNICEF and a child-friendly office from the city to conduct a citywide public space assessment to assess the public spaces, around 60 public spaces in the city. And the project showed that actually the areas in the city that had green public spaces experienced lower temperatures than the other areas in the city. And so based on this assessment that was done through the public space assessment, new measures were proposed to enhance the coverage of green spaces in those areas that were actually lacking public spaces, but also to integrate, for example, cooling water elements in these areas. And since it was also focused on children, also to have shaded play areas for children in these spaces. Then another tool that we have is the Our City Plans toolbox, which really focuses on urban planning, participatory urban planning in cities. It was developed to support mostly smaller to medium-sized cities in the urban planning processes. And we have a digital platform that can be used. There's also a paper version, but the digital platform really allows to adapt the planning process according to the preferences of the city. And Our City Plans, it's divided into 4 phases of planning, from the assessment to the plan, to the operationalization and the implementation. And it is an inclusive participatory process, so we have many participatory activities that are actually integrated into the overall planning process. And you can see, so we have these 4 phases, and then each phase has a specific block and activities and tools integrated into it, and we also integrate resources from UN Habitat, but also other partners that can help the urban planning process. And Our City Plans has been implemented in many cities around the world, but it's also an open source toolkit. So we also are monitoring how it is being actually used by partners from other cities. And we have received feedback, for example, from a city in China, Suzhou. They use this toolkit to plan for promoting and safeguarding cultural heritage in their city. So it's also a way of seeing how actually cities can use freely this tool and adapt it to their local needs. And I just wanted to show, so we have Our City Plans toolbox here, and what is nice about it is that you have these specific filters, which means that cities can actually select if they want to focus on a specific topic, like climate resilience or participation, and they can select the filters according to their preference, and it will select for them specific activities in the planning process that they should focus on. And so why I'm presenting this today is because often we present tools when they are already done, but the Our City Plans toolbox, actually it's a living toolbox, so we try to enhance it more and more and to integrate more elements into it. And currently we are integrating and mainstreaming nature-based solutions into the toolbox to make it a part of the overall urban planning process. And so we're actually having considered some elements that will be integrated. For example, for the assessment phase, we want to integrate how we can integrate citizen assessments into the assessment phase, because we have specific activities for desk and field research. But now we want to see how we can, for example, engage citizens into collecting data on biodiversity that can be part of the planning process. Then in the planning phase, we want to integrate a specific tool that was developed by UN Habitat and University of Pennsylvania, which is the Hotspot Spotlight tool. And that is actually a tool that can be used to see how urban expansion conflicts with biodiversity and to provide guidance on where to plan and where to develop cities based on biodiversity. And then in the operationalization phase, for example, one element we want to look at and that we want to integrate is how we can integrate cost-benefit analysis for nature-based solutions to help cities also see what is the cost and what are the potential benefits of the nature-based solutions, as this is very much linked also to the financial aspect of planning. So I'm presenting this today as we're still in the process of mainstreaming it, and we really want to make it an inclusive tool. So if you have a tool, for example, or a methodology that's using nature-based solutions in urban areas, like the playbook, for example, that was presented, we are very keen to integrate it and to also make it available through this toolbox as part of the overall urban planning process. Thank you.
Alina, round of applause. And it's not just a toolkit, it's a whole toolbox. So you brought everything with you, but very helpful to know and understand how that journey works and the filtering process as well. So thank you for setting that out so clearly. So next, we're going to move straight into a panel discussion. And delighted to have a few people with us to get a little bit of discussion going, who are going to help us dive into this topic in a little more detail with some very different and varied perspectives. So I don't think that Dr. Akinyuga is here. Ah, fantastic. They said, I'm not sure, but please come to the stage and join us. So delighted to welcome Dr. Akinyemi Akinyuga, Technical Advisor on Green Economy and Ecological Matters in Ekiti State in Nigeria. Very welcome. Next up, another local representative, very delighted to have several of them on the stage. Camila Assis, Coordinator of Multilateral Affairs for Sao Paulo, Brazil. Welcome. Next up, Roland Hunziker, Director of the Built Environment for the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Welcome, Roland. Nice to see you. And Martina Guevara from ISOCARP, the International Society of City and Regional Planners. And then I have to move, last but not least, Dr. Alexandre Hejazi, an academic at the University of Geneva, senior lecturer at the Institute for Environmental Sciences and director of the Global Environmental Policy Program at the Geneva UN Charter Center of Excellence on Sustainable Cities. And he wins the contest for having the longest job title that I've had to announce all day long. So, 3 jobs all in one. What we're going to do is first of all invite each of our speakers to briefly introduce themselves and to share their experience in integration of nature-based nature-positive solutions in urban infrastructure. And then maybe we'll come back for a second round on some key messages on how these approaches can be scaled and attract financing in the longer term. So, first up, then I'm going to come to you. Get us going, please. Briefly introduce yourself. If I messed it up, mispronounced your name, or done it badly, please correct me. And then tell us a little bit about your experience of integrating nature-positive solutions into urban infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And you did a very good job pronouncing my name, because people in my country tend to get it very wrong. So that's excellent. And it's a pleasure to be here. I'm so grateful for the invitation and to sit with this distinguished panel and to share some of my experiences within a developing country context. I work as technical advisor to the governor of Ekiti State. That's one of the subnationals in Nigeria. It's in the southwest of Nigeria, equidistant from Lagos, which is very popular, to Abuja, which is the nation's capital. So it's 4.5 hours from Lagos, 4.5 hours from Abuja. We're kind of in between the two big commercial centers of Nigeria. If you imagine a very hilly environment, location, Ekiti State is a very hilly topography, hills and valleys, and lots of rainforest is in the rainforest area of Nigeria. So you could imagine the issues that would be very, very prevalent in the area. Like he mentioned, flooding, heat, and interestingly, fire recently. I wouldn't go into why fire has become an issue because it's not in the context of what we're discussing today. But you've got flooding for obvious issues. The topography is hilly, and because of climate change, when it rains, it pours. And when it pours, the velocity of the water makes it very difficult for people to cope. And again, the geology of the area is kind of like hard pan. So water does not easily percolate into the soil. So you have, when it rains and floods, you have a lot of water flowing within the area in such a short time. And so it's one of the newest states in Nigeria. There was an economic boom in the 2000s. And so basically, this very small town suddenly exploded and became a very big city. And of course, because the economic development was going faster than the planning development, you find a city that is built without a plan, basically. And so everything is scattered all over. There was no respect for flood-prone areas. Everybody was building on the land of his forefathers because he has a lot of money to build. And so you have this mosaic of houses scattered all over a wide geography of place. And when things grew very fast, flooding became a very big issue. So what did we do? From about 6 to 8 years now, we've been thinking of how best do we address these issues, because you have land value has increased significantly. And so if you begin to talk about moving people from one place to the other, it attracts a huge cost. So first and foremost, we decided to tackle it from a governance perspective, that we need to get the laws updated. A lot of the laws were from the colonial era, and they were not fit for the modern context we found ourselves. So the first thing is to try and fix the laws. What laws govern planning of our cities? We started from that. And then two, we went into the institutions, created new institutions that are nimble enough and responsive to the modern problems we were facing. One of the institutions or the offices we created was the EGIS office, to integrate, geographic information system into planning of the city, recognizing areas that are flood prone, looking at the areas that have ecological sensitive species, and trying to make sure that people do not build in some of those areas. And so we went from that and then began to look at things from a watershed perspective, ensuring that people are guided against plant or building on watershed. But that is kind of difficult because land values are high, and people want to build, basically. But a lot of awareness and advocacy and education went into trying to get people to realize that if it doesn't flood your house today, in a couple of years, it's going to flood. And we used other citizens to educate the others. We got people to talk to them about when they moved into their areas. Some people moved into certain areas, and they told us that water was just like, it was nothing. But in 5 years, when it was built upstream, there was problem, and the whole thing became a boomerang. In conclusion, we see this as an opportunity. There's a lot of challenge to face, talking about trying to educate people, telling them that you can't build on your father's land. And we have a lot of ties, ancestral ties to land. But the challenges are there, but we see it as an opportunity to form partnerships, opportunity to have collaborations. We have a collaboration with UN Habitat on a state development plan, and that is going very well. We have a collaboration with Oxford University on a citizen-based biodiversity survey, which is also going very well. And we see this as an opportunity finally to mobilize resources to grow in a very sustainable way. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. You made me laugh a lot, but it's a very serious point. If it's not floating now, it will need to float in 5 years, was a very good point. But what you also said out there was the importance of understanding the local context also of what you said about the topography and geology as well. Great. Camilla, let me come to you. There's a lot of interest in what's happening in Brazil ahead of COP30 next year. Some of that obviously focused on Belém, but also a lot of awareness of the good work that cities like Sao Paulo and others are doing. Tell us a little bit about how you're integrating nature-positive solutions.
Of course. So I'm Camila. I work in the international department. So my work is to connect the good experiences abroad with what the city of São Paulo needs. So I think that in our subconscious, when we think about São Paulo, we see a city of a lot of cars, buildings, but we have also a huge green area. So I was very excited to tell you guys that despite of this decrease of numbers of green areas in other cities, São Paulo is promoting recently the increasement to 27% of green areas. So it's a lot. We have in the extreme south of São Paulo an area with reserve basins, with two most important basins are Billings and Guarapiranga, and we are promoting their cooperation to erase like a linear park when the population could connect to the environment again. So I will tell a little more about this because my work is exactly to connect these international experiences. And I think that's important with the COP30 in Brazil to understand that in the big cities, we also have these huge forests. For example, we have the Atlantic Forest in São Paulo. So we have this program that's called Water Source Program that was created in 1991 to address the social and environmental damage caused by the process of irregular occupation in this area. So the main pillars that we have been working through is urbanization of these settlements, these precarious settlements, the housing units for families, and of course the environment recovery. So for the first time in São Paulo, we are putting aquatic transport. That is something that nobody can think that happens in São Paulo, for example. So I just want to bring this message that São Paulo is more a city than have just urbanization, but we have also green areas.
What a fantastic message, and very succinctly made as well, and thank you for both of those things. But great to hear that example of how in a context like the one that Sao Paulo faces, it's still possible to do that and integrate nature positive solutions. Thank you so much. Roland, let me come to you. The World Business Council has been very active in supporting these kinds of activities. Tell us a little bit more about some examples of how that work is kind of playing out.
Thank you very much, Andy, and it's a great pleasure for me to be here as well. I'm quite involved in the organization of this pavilion with the Global Alliance. I hope next time we will not have the nature session only at the end of the 2 weeks. I think it's the only session here that really focuses on the nature topic, and climate nature are so interconnected, so I hope that next time we'll do it much earlier. But why am I here from the World Business Council? We work with global companies on climate, nature, and tackling inequality. And we look at the built environment from a system level and how various companies that are part of this long value chain, fragmented value chain, work together to manage the climate impacts, because it's 40% of global CO2 emissions, but also increasingly, how do we look at the nature impacts? And we just read along the whole value chain. So really looking at where we build, but also where materials come from to build. And so we're doing that as part of our nature positive roadmaps for business. There's 3 systems that have the biggest impacts on biodiversity and nature. It's of course food and ag, it's energy, and then it's the built environment. 30% of global biodiversity loss is due to what we're building. What's very interesting, and we did this work with the technical support of Arup, and we have here also colleagues here, there is an estimated 90% of these impacts are actually upstream because of the extraction of materials such as cement, aggregates, in particular steel, timber. And so we really need to manage not only on-site impacts, which we have got used to, and you mentioned earlier the net gain, for example, in the UK. These are great tools we have today, but we also need to start looking at those upstream impacts. And that's where the nature and the climate conversation and circularity also come together. Because we know that many of the climate impacts come from materials, but also on nature. So we're doing this work as part of our nature positive roadmaps, and the push also comes from the Task Force for Nature-related Nature-related Financial Disclosure, TNFD. Companies increasingly have to look at their nature impacts also upstream and downstream, and hence this work. Now it's not easy to measure those upstream impacts. It comes, of course, with where you take materials from, in what way it's extracted, it's processed. And so we've done this particular work on exploring the role of buildings to contribute to nature positive. And it's a specific call to action for the designers, but also the developers who create and design buildings in the first place, to take these impacts also into account, and how we start doing that. Now the party begins somewhere else. We still have to wait a little. Yeah. And so it's starting to look at a approach like we use for carbon. We talk about whole life carbon. We say we should build buildings that are energy efficient and that only use renewable energy so that we reduce the overall emissions and also embodied carbon emissions. So we need a similar approach also to manage biodiversity and nature. How do we assess and bring into the design process these upstream impacts? So we had a few key messages that are in this report, and I'm happy to share it also at any point on exploring nature positive buildings, to think global. So how do we reverse the nature loss by 2030 by looking at the whole life cycle of these impacts, and of course to take immediate action. Businesses, developers, design firms, they can do a lot in terms of the mitigation hierarchy. So avoid, where do we avoid building something in the first place? How do we reduce? How do we restore these impacts? How do we regenerate and ultimately transform along the whole value chain? So it starts by understanding, measuring, and then take that action. So it's a bit a different perspective to some of the other perspectives we've heard here, but really important also to focus on those holistic life cycle impacts. Thank you.
No, indeed. And thank you so much for those remarks. We've also been starting to look at the TNFD work as well, and the way that can be integrated. But I fully agree with you on kind of measurement and some of the understanding as the basis for the decision making that follows. So very helpful remarks. Thank you. So then, Martina, ISOCARP, I'll use the acronym. You can explain a bit more about what it is, maybe. Then has also been supporting some of this activity. Tell us a little bit more about that.
So ISOCARP is the International Society of City and Regional Planners, and is an association of planners from around the globe. And I'm a planner and a practitioner as well, as here sort of representing the organization. And I would like to start with a story. Once upon a time, that was like about 6-9 months ago, there was a little piece of land about the size of a football pitch. And that was the piece of land that would have allowed the development of a wetland corridor straddling 3 major landowners. And a naive planner, that was me, working for the middle landowner that also owned that piece of land, thought that would be a great idea to connect it all and create a whole big piece of natural infrastructure that would have also resolved the flooding issue, very sensitive for the community. So rang up the land and property team in the organization and asked about the piece of land. And they laughed at me and they said, you know that we are sued for that piece of land because in the local plan it is identified as part of a development area. We paid agricultural land for it, $500,000, but now we are sued for $8 million. So that is what I want everybody to realize, the value of development compared to the value of nature. If one looks at the before and after the cost of land, it changes from country to country, but roughly speaking is 1 to 10. So 1 is the value of nature on the market. Here I'm talking about the property market. And 10 times if it is developable. So how do you deal with that? That is also something that is, Nigeria, you just explained, this is what happening there. I'm coming from Italy, and Italy in the 50s and 60s became one of, started its growth, and now is one of the G7, but started with no natural resources whatsoever, just on the basis of the exploitation of land and building speculative construction. In China, the municipalities have started to, they could build schools and hospitals, etc., for the community based on expansion, and now that's why they have a housing crisis and a property bubble crisis because they overdeveloped. So that of the push of development is a major issue. So in the Western world, planning started in the 30s and 40s. Exactly to control that, to have organized development, better organized development, but also to prevent or to put areas of protection, prevent development and create non-developable zones or boundaries, that is the development area, and anything outside that boundary is not buildable. There is a lot of corruption, there is a lot of pressure to modify those boundaries, but also is a very blunt instrument, because that is a negative, is you cannot build there, but it doesn't say what you can do there. So now I have three proposals for better planning throughout the world. And the first one is really to think about nature as well as boundaries and try to learn to work across boundaries. Administrative boundaries normally stop at a river, which means that the river basin is half in one authority and half in another authority, or in different countries. Just think about the big, the Nile is part of different countries and is part of disputes, but also part of very many different authorities along its length. So that is one thing that needs to change, to have a mechanism to work across administrative boundaries. The second one has been mentioned before here, is to embed nature-based solution in infrastructure. They also need to have a value, because it's not only the value of preventing development or the cost of preventing development. If one doesn't do anything, if you don't have positive planning, is also the land is left. It's non-buildable land, and it remains degraded land. So there is a double cost, the cost of not developing and the cost of developing a park. So associated to that, it needs to be a value. Understanding the value, the monetary value of nature-based solution in terms of ecosystem services, reducing the size of the drainage system, not having to have a sewage treatment plant, for example, all sorts of things of that sort. And the third one is really having a system of land use classes that identify nature as well. So normally in a local plan, in a GIS, is one green, a non-buildable land. It needs to be more than that. It needs to be 20 shades of green, and it needs to be flood retention, it needs to be forest, it needs to be a lot of things. So that's my proposal.
Perfect. Next blockbuster novel, 20 Shades of Green. We had 50 Shades of Grey, so we've moved on from there now. Very good. Maybe UN Habitat could sponsor that one. There you go, Gulnara. Something for you to think about, keeping all of this very practical. Okay, Alexandre, I'm already impressed, because there's enough work to do in this space, and I have enough trouble doing one job. You have three. So tell us a little bit more about your work and how it's considering nature-positive solutions.
Thank you very much, and I'm pleased to have the ambiance with us. So we have music and enjoyment next door, so it's going to be very easy to describe to you some of the outcome of the work that we are doing in Geneva. Through the research that at some point also included Gulnara when she was in Geneva at UNECE. We started a Center of Excellence on Smart Sustainable Cities, which was precisely what I want to describe, or at least draw from our experience in Geneva, is the science policy interface of NbS, how science can infuse some of the new outcomes into the policy realm, and how the feedback loops from policy can learn us, or at least bring to the attention of scientists and researchers what is needed in terms of pushing forward the NbS agenda. Something that has come to us based on that element, which is a science policy interface and the linkages that we can establish, is first of all, and then I don't need to repeat what was already said in terms of all the benefits of integration of infrastructures, is taking stock of some of the upcoming crises that we'll be dealing across cities. Foresight needs to be included and integrated in our endeavor towards scaling up NbS. One sector that has drawn attention across all the organizations that we've been consulting, UNEP and UN Habitat obviously are also very much involved, is the question of housing. Housing across all member countries, institutions that we've been talking, is going to be a lead source of crisis and a topic of discussion, galvanizes public opinion, which also help us to understand or preempt some of the blockages that we'll be facing in terms of resistance to change and the behavioral dimension. Around that, what we realize is that the environmental impacts of extreme weather events through the surveys that we did. Environmental impacts of the extreme weather events, water management issues, waste management issues, emissions and air pollution, as well as noise pollution and biodiversity really come on top of the list of the concerns of the citizens. And that's where I think we really need to put the focus when it comes to one infrastructure, which is the housing stock bill, and try to understand how to move ahead with that. One other element of the surveys that we've been doing is the importance of sociocultural, and also I add in between parentheses, but nevertheless with big letters, the security pressures in face of climate change that also impacts the endorsement or lack thereof, the end users, inhabitants and population of NbS projects. This concerns the question of, once again, affordability, how NbS projects can affect affordability of, let's say, the transport or any other kind of infrastructure that we want to deploy. The social cohesion issue is also very important. Cities where we are working witness a lot of polarization, and NbS projects and integration of infrastructure really need to showcase that polarization is being dealt with and social cohesion is being pushed forward. The question of psychological stress is also something that, as a result of higher density, energy efficient building and so on and so forth, is becoming a key element that needs to be addressed as it's becoming a concern of the population. The importance of the optimized use of resources for circular economy, and then this last element, which is about the security, is about data security, data and privacy, and citizens' rights. People are increasingly concerned about the devices that they use, but at the same time how these devices and the data that they produce can be used against them. On another front, what we realize, and this is I'm going to end up on that, is the importance of firmly embedding whatever infrastructure integration project we have, an NbS project we have, in the urban design process, but also in the ancestors of nature-based solutions that have already been deployed for, if not centuries, many decades in the cities. This embedment is extremely important to also bring the population, the end users, towards the optimum use of these projects. We should not overestimate the capacity or underestimate the capacity of the population, not embrace some of these wonderful projects that we are talking about. Resistance to change and behavioral dimension exist, and we really need to bring this and factor it into our projection of what these NbSs can produce.
Thank you so much, and fully agree. That's a point that we've definitely heard from local leaders is, I've had this great green idea, but maybe it's in the wrong location, or maybe it's not exactly the right solution, or it doesn't fit with the cultural heritage of the
And the people
area.
don't take ownership of this project.
Yeah, exactly that. And for nature-positive solutions really to thrive in cities, that community engagement and ownership is so important. Fantastic way to end the first round. So I'm going to put our panel on standby. I'm going to come to our audience in a second so you can get ready. You've heard from our wonderful panelists, but if you have any questions, I'm going to give you a chance to ask them in a moment. And then what we're going to do is come back along the line the other way, and I'm going to ask our panelists any thoughts about how we scale some of the solutions that you've heard about, and how, any examples you've got about attracting finance. So first, any immediate questions for our panelists? Gulnara, you must have a question.
My question will be methodological, kind of. I think we have different technical cooperation projects in cities on nature-based solutions. So how you ensure that, I think first question is, like I know Alexander, for instance, I think was very interesting project that we did in Geneva on biodiversity, promoting biodiversity, for instance. like how you ensure that like the projects that you are doing in cities actually are multifunctional, because like we're speaking about promoting nature-based solutions in cities, like we do in Manaus in Brazil, for instance, one of the projects in Colombia. Sometimes we do it for promoting biodiversity, sometimes we're doing to support cooling, sometimes we do it to promote livelihoods. Are there kind of methodologies, kind of maybe templates or frameworks to ensure that when you do these nature-based solutions, you kind of ensure that you protect biodiversity, restore ecosystem? So is there a methodology which ensures that the solution you offer actually checks all the boxes?
Great question. So, are there any methodologies that ensure you tick all the boxes? That sounds like an ISO-carp question to me.
No, I don't have an answer to that, actually. But I would say that the box that or the link that needs to be made and the box that needs to be ticked is the interface with urban infrastructure. So, the green roofs to reduce the discharge of water into the wastewater system and the stormwater system and things like that. Because that is, in my experience of working in different countries, people understand nature and they are not, the biodiversity message is very easy. It's the finance that's difficult, and the finance comes if it is part of an infrastructure plan. If it is part of a greening plan, of a beautification plan, is a nice to have. If it is part of, let's manage the stormwater system better, let's reduce the flooding risk, then it works better.
Yeah, very good. And a long debate about the nature of infrastructure and what constitutes infrastructure then follows long into the night. Roland, anything you want to add?
I'd like to come to the link with finance, but starting with something that Robert said on the Nature Positive Solutions handbook that they created. And he said, look, developers or investors or whoever sits at the beginning of projects, they should incentivize us. They should ask us to do studies on how nature or hybrid solutions can help. And I think that is exactly the problem, that finance, somebody needs to borrow money to do something, pushes for speed and reducing time. And we don't have that time then to do these studies. In Geneva, and I now forget the name of the neighborhood, I visited an excellent project where they really do studies thoroughly. It's towards Tonne for the locals. And the recipe, they said, is that we have been given time. We are being given time by the city and by those who are investing to do these thorough studies. And then you can do stakeholder engagement, you can speak with the citizens, you can work on ecosystem and biodiversity plans. I think this is an elephant in the room, and that links to finance. Finance is not a problem. Finance is available everywhere. You talk to anyone who says, that's not the issue. The problem is we don't have good projects today, and that needs time. And for that, we need to reduce that pressure on the development process. So, and now, of course, then we need to find the solutions wherever we are. We are here from Nigeria, Brazil, Switzerland, and Italy, you said. It may look a little different everywhere, how these processes are, but I think that point Robert made is really critical. We have the knowledge, but we need to be allowed to apply it. And very important to take that whole life perspective. Because again, some of these benefits come only later. So unless we do that, we will always be stuck.
No, fabulous, and fully agree.
Sorry to
interject. No, go.
Which is obviously a problem of the funding system in developing countries. You spend more time applying for funding than actually you have the time to put the projects together, and that is we as developed countries propose one solution and then we don't enable the execution.
Yeah, very good. I'm going to come to the idea of project preparation and pre-financing in a moment, but Akinyemi, anything to add?
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, it's like the speakers took a leaf from my writings here. Nature takes time. It's not in the microwave region. You know, for a tree to grow and properly sequester carbon, it takes years. But the finance cycle works in an ROI cycle that wants return as quickly as possible. And so we need to be able to reconcile all these seemingly competing interests and find a center point where we can, focus things and enable nature-based solutions to really come on track. And the thing about finance, I mean, recently there's a school of thought that says you shouldn't, and Martina mentioned it, you can't take climate or nature-based projects in isolation. A lot of people won't listen to you. But if you integrate it or brand it or develop it as a development finance project, then you get people to be willing to fund it. But again, we need to ask questions about what is the terms of the financing, what's the architecture of the financing. If it's more of the same, then we wouldn't get to where we want to go to. So those conversations have to be had about what is the governance, what is the architecture of financing nature-based solutions.
No, fantastic. And I just wanted to add, in addition to your point about timescale, that often the provision of capital is also about de-risking that transaction. And to the point somebody made earlier, there's a misperception in some cases that nature-based solutions are inherently more risky than pouring concrete, or other grey solutions. And I think we need to consider how we can remove that as well. Camilla, anything you wanted to add?
I just want to come back to the previous discussion because it's something that we have been discussing a lot with Brazilian cities, especially with the Minister of Cities, Jardim Filho. That's the problem of the cities don't know how to apply the projects. So in Brazil reality, we have budget. In the same occurs in São Paulo, for example, but we don't know how to access this. So I think that to be connected and make this translation of international guidelines to our public policy, it's important. So during this last year, São Paulo has working to translate these guidelines to the population and also to our governments, because they have to understand the political value to accomplish some international standards, for example, the Paris Agreement. So São Paulo, for example, has the Climate Action Plan that relates every target of the municipality with the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think that is step by step, so trying to understand how to put in the municipality, trying to understand also what the community wants, and to make them understand how this could be helpful to their daily life. So in São Paulo, we have transformed our bus fleet to electric buses, but the population are concerned if the bus is going to be better than the other. They don't know, they are not concerned about like the environment. So you have to impact really the life of people, I think.
Yeah, fantastic. Just for the record, electric buses are fantastic. And also want to say that the Global Covenant of Mayors, C40 Cities, ICLEI, UCLG and others are supporting this initiative called CHAMP, the Coalition for High Ambition Multi-Level Partnerships. And what that tries to do is link what's happening at the local and regional level to national government policy on climate through the Paris Agreement. And the more we can formalize and embed some of that multi-level governance, then I think the stronger the role that some of those local voices will be. And I also think the role of test beds and demonstrators in the case of some of these newer technologies and so on. It's important to be able to demonstrate and set things in the right context. Alexander.
Just very quickly to answer to Gulnara's question. From our experience in Geneva, I think what we can say, and it worked in Geneva, we hope that it can, and we anticipate it can work elsewhere, is that from the start, we are not sure how to evaluate some of these projects as they are hybrid. There are, they aspire, or the objective is to produce co-benefits and so on and so forth. So one of the impediments.
No. Your
one of the impediments that we are facing is the question of interoperability of indicators to evaluate progress, to evaluate success. Obviously, one thing that we want to see in most of these projects through the use of the population is to see as many as people embracing these projects and using this project. But nevertheless, when it comes to biodiversity, we have other sets of indicators. And one project which in Geneva has been extremely successful is precisely based on, which basically brings in quality public space, production of a biodiversity driven kind of a marshland. It's the coastal lakeside, public space and recreation and so on. Is that once we have these sets of indicators, we need to sit down, as Roland was saying, and try to see how these indicators can work together and how we can push forward the interoperability of indicators. And based on that, we can assess progress, we can prove the progress, and then go for funding and all sorts of other, and scale up. Because from pilot to scaling up, that's what it is.
Look, you just stole my next question. So fantastic. If our audience are okay, then we've only got a few minutes left, but I do want to come back down the line. I wanted to touch on how do we scale all of this? We've heard about individual examples, the role of some guidance, key publications, and some of the standard setting. Tell us your thoughts about, how now, with some early understanding of how projects are impacting at the local level, some beginnings of a framework through TNFD and others to think about how we calculate or sort of calculate multiple impacts and co-benefits. How do we go from there and really try to embed this in as many cities as possible and in less than 1 minute? Go.
Well, in Geneva, it has been very easy, and across Switzerland, what we see is that the identification of same topography or topology of space that we want to upgrade, same topology of topography or historicity of infrastructure integration, and once we do the mapping. With the success story of our pilot project, scaling up can follow the other low-hanging fruits in terms of localization, but also the output. The mapping of these or hierarchization or topology of the spaces that we want to upgrade and infrastructure integration that will drive them is extremely important from the beginning, so that once the pilot is successful, we can push the agenda fast forward towards the next ones.
Fantastic. Some really good advice there on how to fast forward. Martina.
I will repeat what I said before in a slightly different way. We think we need plans and we need planning because that's the first step. If you don't have that non-developable zone, you have the cost of the land 1 to 10 is what is going to kill off anything else. So for every city that doesn't have a plan, it should have one. For each city that has an old plan, should look at it again. And that is the first step. And then the second step is to learn to introduce in planning positive nature planning. So there's 20 shades of green.
All right, well, Golnara is definitely going to have to find some money in 2025 for this. Then fantastic. Roland, take us from there.
My answer is a new public-private partnership, because we have now the urgency. We're under the effects of climate change. We know we need to act fast. We actually have all the knowledge. But also, a solution here is not the same as a solution there. So people who talk about replication and scaling, they're a bit dreaming, in my view, sometimes. But in every place, and as you say, there is the knowledge. It sits in the private sector, it sits in the city, it sits with the people. But we're not bringing it together sufficiently today. So we need a new approach of working together. So yeah, it's 1 minute, so over.
No,
we can talk about that another time.
Yeah, all right. We'll find a pub somewhere. Very good. Camilla, from the perspective of moving beyond Sao Paulo, you talked about the value of engaging with the national government, even across Brazil. How do you see some of these approaches scaling?
So I think that exchange experience is central, and we're starting to work this more internally in Brazil, because as Jarder has mentioned many times, the cities that make the projects are always the same, São Paulo, Curitiba, so we are making a group of cities to change this technology, and I think that this is the path.
Fully agree with you, and I'm going to come back to that in my 30 seconds of concluding remarks as well. So fully support that. Akinyemi.
Yeah, plans, partnerships, and people. You know, plans, like Martina said, partnerships across the broad range of stakeholders, and we need to remember that it's all about people. Thank you.
Whoa, I have never moderated a panel all week who have been that well behaved. So thank you all very much for that. I like plans, partnerships and people as a new form of PPP. I've heard others say that we need people, public-private partnerships elsewhere also during the course of being here in the second week of COP. Two key takeaways that I took away is very much about understanding the concerns of citizens and making sure that there is community engagement and deep local understanding as early in project development life cycles on nature positive solutions as possible. And very much agree with your point, Camilla, about exchange of experiences. That's why networks like the Global Covenant of Mayors exist, is to enable mayors and local leaders to go, I saw this idea in Curitiba. Now, how do we take that elsewhere? We have a program, Cities Meet Cities, which is doing exactly that, helping technical teams from different local governments get together across a whole range of issues and have supported peer network and exchange, even between some of our global governing board of mayors, between mayors in Canada and Lebanon, looking at nature conservation approaches. So, Gulnara, thank you very much. I think it was you for inviting me to moderate. A massive round of applause for our very insightful panel. To our keynote speakers and our tool presenters. And to all of you for still being here late on a Thursday at the end of the second week of COP29. If you're involved in any of the discussions and negotiations, good luck for what comes in the next, hopefully 24, 36 hours. I hope it doesn't turn into 48 hours, but very much look forward to the outcomes from COP29 and moving forward from there to COP30. Thank you very much.